You're listening to the Decisive podcast, insights and analysis to empower confident decision making. Welcome to another episode of the Decisive podcast. I'm your host, Kristen Hallam, lead content strategist for Global Intelligence and Analytics. Today, I have Dijedon Imeri joining us to discuss the European Union parliamentary elections and their potential impact on the business landscape. Dijedon is a principal analyst for Europe, CIS country risk at S&P Global Market Intelligence. Welcome, Dijedon.
Thank you, Kristen. It's a pleasure to be here.
So we're a few weeks out from the elections now, and the dust has settled a bit. Let's start off with a quick recap of what happened. Dijedon, can you walk us through the results, please?
Yeah, sure. One of the biggest topics around these elections was the far right and how they would perform in these elections. There was a lot of talk in the run up to the elections and also afterwards in mainstream media about a surge of the far right. But if you actually look at the results, it wasn't quite like that. It didn't quite materialize. They did increase their share of the votes by a few percentage points and also the number of seats in parliament. And between them, the European Conservatives and Reformists, the Identity and Democracy Group, the German AfD, and Hungary's Fidesz party have around 156 MEPs out of a total of 720. So, that is a sizable chunk. And provided that they're actually able to overcome a lot of their differences, which is not really likely for several reasons, but assuming that, then they would indeed be a very formidable bloc. Now, we have to weigh this against the fact that despite some setbacks, the mainstream political groups that are pro-EU and in favor of the European Green Deal retain between them a majority of seats. So despite a lot of the precipitous losses suffered by, for example, Renew Europe and the Greens, for example, this was somewhat compensated by the strong performance of the European People's Party, the EPP, to which Ursula von der Leyen's CDU party belongs. So assuming that this sort of centrist and mainstream bloc opts to continue their cooperation, they will be able to determine the policy direction going forward. And then we'll get into this later as well. This entirely depends on what the EPP wants to do. On some issues, there might actually be convergence between the EPP and political groups to the right of it. And this might result in cooperation, at least on an ad hoc basis. We don't think it will be formalized because the EPP wants to hold on to its sort of pro-EU credentials. But certainly on an ad hoc basis on individual policy issues, there might be convergence.
Thanks for that overview. That's really helpful context for us to have for the rest of our conversation today. Can you tell us what were the key issues driving voters in this election?
Yes, it's interesting. If you have a sort of national breakdown, if you look at individual countries, there are obviously some recurring themes, but with different emphasis. So, for example, the Nordic countries, they ran against the grain insofar as the more left-wing and green parties were able to prevail in those countries, which stands in sharp contrast to countries like France, Germany, Austria, as well as Italy, where the far right were able to achieve the biggest gains. But obviously, some of the recurring themes include the cost of living crisis, which, although inflation is coming down, there remains a key concern for European citizens. Things like migration as well, and also climate policy. And this last one is an interesting one because although there remains a very broad public support for climate action in Europe, there are some key and influential constituencies that are skeptical of the European Green Deal, or at least elements of it. And here I would highlight the protesting farmers, for example, who made a concerted effort to protest aspects of the European Green Deal, putting pressure on EU institutions and also political groups running for these elections to kind of change track and review and revisit some of the policies that impact the agricultural sector. And to this end, for example, the European Commission backtracked on its proposal to halve the pesticide use by 2030. And you also had mainstream political groups like the EPP shifting towards the right on a lot of these individual issues in order to court protesting farmers. And this was reflected in their political programs and manifestos. And I think this was reflected in the rightward shift of the European Parliament. But again, as I mentioned earlier, this shift wasn't so dramatic in terms of the actual results. If you look at them at a superficial level, the crucial point is to look at the rightward shift that was imminent to or that happened within mainstream groups like the EPP, which, to be sure, or to be very clear, they remain formally very much committed to the European Green Deal, and they are very serious about maintaining their pro-EU credentials. And it remains to be seen going forward in the next coming weeks and months to what extent this was purely a tactical consideration or whether we're seeing a genuine shift towards the right. The shift towards the right in the European Parliament might actually be a bit more significant than is immediately obvious or transparent when we just look at the election results at a superficial level.
Interesting to hear some themes that are common in other elections and in other geographies as well. And I think we'll be talking more about climate later in our conversation. But let's step back for a moment and talk about the role of the European Parliament compared with the role of the European Commission and the Council of the EU. How do these different bodies work together?
One way to conceptualize this is as a triangle that determines and shapes the policies and legislation of the European Union. If you want to draw a parallel to a national government and the sort of traditional division of powers, the European Parliament falls more squarely into the legislative branch type of role, in that it enacts and ratifies legislation. The European Commission is more of an executive branch, and the Council of the European Union shares characteristics with both. In this triangle, the European Parliament occupies a very central role insofar as it can grant or withhold the approval of the President of the European Commission and other commissioners. So this will be very relevant in the coming weeks. And with respect to the Council, it is still subordinate to the Council in many ways because the EU still has a lot of intergovernmental characteristics. So it is not a full-fledged union in many ways. So to take foreign and defense policy, for example, these are more the remit of the Council of the European Union. But since the Lisbon Treaty, the European Parliament has been elevated in many ways to an equal footing with the Council. So these two institutions are co-legislators in a vast majority of policy areas, which range from, say, climate policy and the environment, to agriculture, to structural funds and immigration, and also perhaps most importantly, the approval of the multi-annual financial framework or the EU budget. And this is obviously very key because it determines spending priorities and policy direction. So in this regard, the European Parliament has been elevated and it is very influential. And through some of these channels, including the approval of the EU budget, it also wields indirect influence over policy areas where it does not have formal remit, like, say, for example, foreign policy, but also the enlargement process and so on and so forth.
Thanks for putting that into context. That's really helpful for our listeners, particularly those who may not be familiar with these institutions. So, back to the parliamentary election results. Do these results have any implications for either the European Commission or for the Council of the EU?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, obviously, the most immediate impact will be on the Commission. As I mentioned, the European Parliament has the power to withhold or grant the approval of the nominee of the next president of the Commission and other commissioners. So it has a direct influence on the composition of the European Commission, which of course sets the policy agenda of the European Union. So that will be the immediate impact. In terms of its relationship with the Council, here it's a bit more complicated. Historically, the European Parliament has played the role of a progressive countervailing force to the Council. To take the concrete example of climate and environmental policy, historically, the European Parliament has always advocated and lobbied for more ambitious targets, say, for example, targets for the greenhouse gas emissions cuts. And as a result of negotiations between these two institutions, the net result has typically been a target that has been more ambitious than if the council would have been the sole factor to decide these targets. And this tension between these two institutions could potentially dissipate somewhat if the rightward shift of political groups like the EPP is genuine, if we indeed see a European Parliament that is more cautious when it comes to the scope and pace of the rollout of green regulations. And that might reduce the level of ambition that the EU has with respect to the green transition. So that would be one way in which this interplay between the Council and the European Parliament might be impacted by these elections.
Thanks for illustrating that for us. So, what are some of the potential legislative impacts of increased representation of parties that are labeled as right wing or more right wing?
Before I answer that question, I think it's important to stress that we're not dealing with a monolith. So there are quite a few different parties and groups that comprise this, and they are divided on a lot of issues, including on Ukraine, fiscal policy, but also at the level of political instinct. We have to remember that at a sort of very visceral level, they are quite averse to pan-European cooperation and agreements. And I think this fact alone will serve as an impediment to them coming together and forming a sort of united bloc. If that were to happen, they would be a very formidable bloc, I think, with around 156 MEPs. But that's a very big if, and it's not our baseline scenario. However, there are some commonalities, and if there is convergence on these commonalities, not just within this sort of group of parties and forces that are commonly labeled as far right, but also convergence with more mainstream political groups like the EPP, that's where we can see a meaningful impact on legislation and policymaking. This would probably be on an ad hoc basis, so it wouldn't be formalized, not least because on the EPP side, they would very much like to continue their formal cooperation with other mainstream groups and avoid affiliating with far right groups. But where there's convergence, there could definitely be ad hoc majorities in place. To take one example, the majority of the legislation that comprise the European Green Deal have already been enacted. But there's one important element that is yet to be decided, and this is the 2040 interim greenhouse gas reduction target. Well, as you're probably aware, the 2030 target has already been decided. This is a 55% reduction compared to levels measured in 1990. And then there's obviously the net zero target for 2050. But the 2040 target is yet to be determined. And back in February, the European Commission came out with a proposal to basically set this at 90%, which is at the lower bound of what was proposed by the EU scientific advisors. As you might imagine, the political groups to the left of the EPP have largely come out in favor of this proposal. Those who have been critical of it have said that it's not ambitious enough, but none have wanted to bring it lower than that. In contrast to this, the groups to the right of the EPP have been critical of this proposal, saying that it is harmful to industry and European competitiveness. And interestingly, here the EPP occupies an intermediate position insofar as it expressed caution and said that whatever target is agreed, it needs to take into consideration the interests of agriculture and industry. And so here you have a potential area or piece of legislation where there might be potential convergence between groups that are commonly labeled as far right and some groups in the center. And then there's obviously also the implementation phase of the European Green Deal. So as I mentioned, although most legislation has already been ratified, a lot more needs to be done in terms of supportive legislation, say, for example, for the Critical and Raw Materials Act. And here the European Parliament might play a role in eroding or watering down some of these legislative proposals. So that will be a key thing to look at. But again, a very central role will be played by mainstream groups like the EPP.
Right, sounds like lots of moving parts for you to watch there. So, Dijedon, what are the potential implications for trade policies and trade agreements with non-EU countries?
So, in terms of trade treaties and agreements, here again, we have to remember that the institutional body that negotiates on behalf of the European Union is the European Commission. The role that European Parliament plays in this regard is obviously in the approval of the next Commission. So, not just the president of the Commission, but also say the trade commissioner, etc. And so the composition of the next European Commission will very much help us understand the travel of direction. But it's important to put the European Parliament elections in the broader context. And here it's interesting to see that there's been a lot of momentum behind a more protectionist turn. Certainly not at the level of what we've seen in the United States, for example, but in that direction. And this is how we should interpret the recent decision by the European Commission to introduce tariffs on Chinese manufactured electric vehicles. This is a provisional measure, but ultimately it will be determined and decided by the Council of the European Union. The general shift seems to be in this direction. So probably this will continue to be the theme going forward as EU policymakers seek to shield and nurture sectors that are directly exposed to international competitive pressures.
Again, it's interesting to see the commonalities, political issues, elections, and other geographies,
Yeah.
particularly that protectionism theme, as you mentioned, a big one in the US. So, how do you see the European Parliament's role in shaping the EU's foreign policy agenda, particularly in relation to countries like Ukraine, which you mentioned earlier?
Here, again, it's important to stress that the formal responsibility as far as foreign policy is concerned rests with the Council of the European Union and the European Commission. So these are the bodies that represent the EU on the international stage. And a lot of the instruments at the EU's disposal also rest with these two institutions. So if we take Russia, Ukraine, for example, a lot of the measures that the EU has brought to bear against Russia are the sole prerogative of the Council of the European Union, notably sanctions. So this is an area which the European Parliament doesn't have influence over as such. And we can also see this in the context of how the European Union has approached the Western Balkan region as well, where the European Parliament has advocated a tougher stance against member states that haven't aligned their foreign policy with the EU because of its limited instruments and ability to respond to these countries. It hasn't really been able to put any meaningful pressure on these candidate countries. But there are ways in which the European Parliament, at least in theory, can wield a lot of influence. And I mentioned earlier at the beginning of our talk that the European Parliament stands on an equal footing with the Council as far as the EU budget is concerned. So the budget has to be approved by both of these institutions, by both the Council and the European Parliament. This is a channel through which the European Parliament is able to influence foreign policy. To take a very concrete example, earlier this year, there was a revision to the EU budget, which included the Ukraine facility, worth around 50 billion euros, which is obviously very crucial to the Ukrainian war effort. That had to be signed off not just by the Council, but also by the European Parliament. And so that would be a potential area where the European Parliament could, in theory, play an obstructive role.
Mm.
Uh, but with respect to Ukraine specifically, again, it's not likely to happen. Most of the political groups in the parliament are still very much in favor of continued support for Ukraine. And this includes even elements of the far right. So, going back to the earlier theme, we're not talking about a monolith here. So, the European Conservatives and Reformist groups, for example, which includes Italy's Brothers of Italy, are much more sympathetic to provision of continued military and financial support for Ukraine. This stands in contrast to the Identity and Democracy group, which is a bit more skeptical of this and have lobbied for peace negotiations with Russia. So, they're not really united on this particular issue. So, with respect to Ukraine, for the time being, we'll see a lot of continuity. And this will be especially the case if the Council's nominations for the President of the European Commission, namely Ursula von der Leyen, and the nominee for the next top diplomat to replace Josep Borrell, Estonia's Kaja Kallas, if they're approved, then we'll see a high degree of foreign policy continuity.
More things for us to watch out for there. Um,
That's right.
yes. Dijedon, how do you see the European Parliament's role in influencing and determining the content and the scope of rules and regulations that are exported abroad? Because, of course, the EU, can be a bellwether for regulations in other countries and have a lot of
Yeah.
influence, particularly on climate.
Yeah, indeed. And I think this also dovetails with your previous question. So this is another channel through which the European Parliament can actually influence foreign policy, because to the extent that we can speak of a coherent foreign policy strategy of the European Union, I think climate issues play a very significant role. The EU has sought to carve out a leadership role for itself as a proponent for the green transition, both at home and abroad. This is very evident if you look at the design of policies like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which really seeks to incentivize the adoption of similar regimes abroad. The European Parliament has played a very crucial role in terms of increasing the level of ambition as far as regulations are concerned, and then by extension also the level of ambition for the best practices and regulations that the EU seeks to export abroad as well. And so, if this kind of ambition is lowered as a result of a rightward shift, which again remains to be seen, then by extension, the regulations and best practices, the ambition of those that the EU seeks to export will also be lowered. Another area in which the European Parliament plays a very important role is in the area of green aid. As I mentioned, the European Parliament also is a co-legislator of the EU budget. So if we see a European Parliament that is less willing to contribute to things like the loss and damage fund, then that might also undermine the EU's soft power abroad, especially with developing countries. And that might undermine the EU's leadership status as far as the green transition is concerned.
So, what indicators should businesses and investors monitor to assess the evolving risk environment in the EU following the elections? And you've already hinted at a few of them.
The key indicator will be the composition of the next European Commission. And on the one hand, this might seem like a straightforward thing. Obviously, as I mentioned, between them, the mainstream pro EU bloc retained its parliamentary majority. We're talking about the EPP, the Socialists and Democrats, and the Liberals, who have just under 400 MEPs, which in theory should be more than enough. Ursula von der Leyen, who was just nominated for a second term last week by the Council of the European Union, would only need a simple majority in the European Parliament, so 361 MEPs. And this vote will maybe happen as early as this month, so at the first plenary session of the European Parliament on the 18th of July. But we have to remember that some of the political parties that comprise this mainstream bloc have voiced skepticism about supporting von der Leyen again. And so, assuming a defection rate, she might have a very thin margin indeed to be reappointed. Just for context, when she was approved the first round in 2019 for her first term, she did so with a very thin majority of 9 MEPs. Um,
Ooh.
and so, yeah, it's a very tight race indeed for her. And so it might be the case that she cannot rely exclusively on the support of her allies, that she might indeed have to venture outside of this bloc to look for a sort of fallback. And this presents her with additional challenges. So if she were to go to the left of the EPP, if she were to court the Greens, for example, this would risk incensing her own CDU party, who have voiced skepticism about collaborating with the Greens. Conversely, if she were to court groups to the right of the EPP, so there have been speculations about her collaborating with the Brothers of Italy, of Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, that would probably alienate the Socialists and Democrats and Renew Europe, both of whom have said that they would discontinue, let's say, their cooperation with von der Leyen and the EPP if that were to happen. Obviously, this is a secret ballot, so that gives her some maneuverability to cobble together some form of majority of support. But again, she is in a very difficult situation with respect to achieving this level of support. And depending on which way she goes, whether she goes to the right or the left, that would inevitably also entail striking some type of bargain, which has ramifications for things like the level of ambition going forward for green regulations, etc.
Well, I'll put that date in my calendar for sure. So it's time to wrap up our conversation. Dijedon, any final thoughts for our listeners?
It would be remiss of me to not talk about the obvious one. Is perhaps beyond the scope of this particular conversation, but still worth mentioning: the French elections, the snap elections rather, which were triggered as a direct consequence of the European Parliament elections. And I think this is a very good example of how the European Parliament elections feed into the dynamics at the national level. And obviously, depending on the outcome of what happens in France, that will feed back into what happens at EU level. So there's this dialectical relationship. And this is very important because, France is not any member state. I think a Eurosceptic
Right.
turn in smaller member states would be better absorbed. But France is, alongside Germany, one of the two biggest economies and founding members of the EU that has been a driving force behind European integration. And so a reversal of that would have huge implications, assuming that the National Rally, the far right party that came on top in the first round of elections, the second will be held in this coming Sunday. But assuming that they remain true to the anti EU agenda, that could spell trouble for the future of the European project. So this is a very big one to consider and look out for.
Thank you for flagging that. We are planning a podcast episode on the outcome of the French elections, the final outcome. So something to stay tuned for. And now all that's left for me to do is to thank you so much, Dijedon, for taking the time to share your insights with us. Thank you for listening to the Decisive podcast from S&P Global. Please subscribe and join us for next week's episode. Until then, stay curious and stay informed.